We post a very special guest who comes from a very prestigious family. His uncle was a beloved president. His father was an attorney general, and he ran for president. Both were assassinated. He has serious ideas for a very serious time in our history. Let me welcome today, the son of Robert F. Kennedy Sr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Welcome to the broadcast.
Very happy to be here with you, Armstrong. Thanks for having me.
Your mother, 95-year-old Ethel Kennedy, is still alive?
Yeah, she is. She's actually right next door right now.
What a blessing.
Yeah, it is a blessing. She's had an amazing life, and she's a larger-than-life character and an extraordinary character. And she has great humor, and she's a wonderful storyteller, and she's beloved by our whole family.
Is there so much pressure when you think about the fact that you, as a Kennedy, when you think about your uncles and your relatives and what has happened to the Klan, and here you are today running for president of the United States, so much has changed. What kind of burden, what kind of opportunity does that present for you that comes from such political royalty?
Well, I never looked at it as a burden. I think I experience it as a privilege. I feel like a very lucky person to have been born into our family. We were taught from when we were little, we all grew up with the idea that our lives would be consumed by some great controversy, and that it would be a great privilege for us to play some role in it, and that the fact that I grew up in this family just gives me a whole retinue of access and other privileges that allow me to have had a very, very rich life. So I'm very, it hasn't always been, it's like everything in life, Armstrong. We all take our licks, and life is a mix of tragedy and struggle, and hopefully we can hopefully we can treat pain as a touchstone for spiritual growth, and that we can take those those times that are painful, those crisis times in our life, and turn that pain transform it into an opportunity for wisdom. The word wisdom means a knowledge of God's will, a knowledge of right and wrong, an instinct for right and wrong. And we're all on different paths, but our path ultimately is toward God and toward light. And whatever that means to each of us, we have to figure it out for ourselves. And I've been lucky enough to have a life that is filled with those opportunities for growth, but also filled with a lot of fun and a lot of richness.
I'm so happy you talked about transformation and growth. I was just reading some of the things you said in the past, and whatever you said about Ronald Reagan and 9/11, Hugo Chavez, and your family, what you may have said about vaccines and children and autism. I want to give you a chance at the beginning of this broadcast to show how you've evolved in your understanding, your thinking, and where you are today on these issues versus the Robert F. Kennedy of yesterday.
Well, okay, well, I don't know. I mean, why don't we talk about it issue by issue? What are you interested in?
So let's just start with some people don't understand with the autism and vaccinations, but obviously the media loves sound bites, and they don't really give a person the full context to explain their position. So in terms of autism, kids being vaccinated and autism is brought about, talk about and discuss that with our audience so you can give us a clear understanding where you are and when it relates to the vaccines and your comments that it's continued played in the press on the issue of autism.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of vaccines, My position has always been misstated in the press. I've never been anti-vaccine. I'm called anti-vax. But all I've said is that we should have the same testing protocols for vaccines that we give to other medicines, which means placebo-controlled trials prior to licensure. And unfortunately, vaccines are exempt from those. And so, without those kind of tests, we cannot tell whether that product is going to avert more problems than it's causing. And the vaccine schedule has increased dramatically because they're very, very profitable. So we've gone from having 3 vaccines when I was little to having 72 doses of 16 vaccines for children today, for my kids' generation. And none of those vaccines has ever been tested prior to getting their license in a placebo-controlled trial. And many of those vaccines are for illnesses that are not casually contagious. For example, the hepatitis B vaccine, where kids are given 4 or 5 of those doses. The first one while they're still in the hospital. And that's a disease that is spread mainly through sexual transmission and through intravenous drug use. And so we really need to understand its impacts on a baby, who has zero risk for that disease. And yet we've never done that kind of testing. And when we the year that we changed the vaccine schedule dramatically began around 1989. And that year we saw a tremendous growth in chronic disease in this country. By chronic disease, I mean neurological diseases like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, and autism. We also saw explosions suddenly of peanut allergies and other food allergies. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I had 11 siblings and probably around 70 first cousins. And nobody had a peanut allergy. So why do 5 of my 7 kids have allergies? Well, that's a question that, we should be able to answer. The asthma exploded that year. My little brother had asthma. He was told by a doctor that this disease is they will never have a cure for it because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. Well, today, 1 out of every 4 Black children in urban areas has asthma. So what happened? The third category is autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and 100 other autoimmune diseases that suddenly exploded around 1989. With autism, we went from having, in my generation, 1 in every 10,000 people my age has full-blown autism, full-blown. And that means nonverbal, non-toilet trained, head banging, violent, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping. You don't see people like that my age, but in my kids' generation, it's 1 in 34. So we went from having 1 in, 2 or 3,000, 1 in 10,000 for people my age, to 1 in 34 my kids' age. So what happened? So, somebody needs to answer that question. We know that Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. EPA came back and said 1989. It's a red line. So something happened in 1989. Well, there's a famous toxic. We know this is, it has to be an environmental exposure because genes don't cause epidemics. Genes can provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So there's a very famous toxicologist named Phil Landrigan that I've brought over 500 lawsuits, including some of the most important lawsuits on environmental and toxicology issues in the last 30 years, including the Monsanto case and many, many others. And there's a toxicologist that we've used on many of these cases named Phil Landrigan in New York. at Mount Sinai, and Phil Landrigan has done a series of papers saying, okay, what was it? What are the possibilities that follow that timeline? And one of those is neonicotinoid pesticides, which exploded that year. Another is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient of Roundup, which exploded that year. You need to find a toxic exposure that affected is ubiquitous. It affected every demographic in this country, from Cubans in Key Biscayne, Miami, to Inuit in Alaska. Everybody was touched that year. So what could it be? Well, those are two, neonicotinoids and glyphosate. PFOAs, which is a flame retardant, which was put around that era in children's pajamas and in all of our furniture. Oh, we all have exposures. It's now in almost every big municipal water supply in this country. And now I was involved in the lawsuit on PFOAs as well, a number of lawsuits. Atrazine, which is another pesticide that is in about 63% of our water supply.
You know, I do find it I find it fascinating how one issue leads to another. Obviously, this is something that you're very passionate about and done your research on. Inflation has been a persistent problem since 2020, and it hit a high of 9.1% in June of 2022. And although it has come down significantly from then, today the core inflation rate started to creep up again from 3% last month to 3.2% this month. Mr. Kennedy, what caused this inflation? Whose fault is it? And as president, what specific policies would you undertake to make sure we don't have it again?
Well, the fault can be attributed to a whole string of presidents and Congress people who have continue to fund things that we don't have the money to pay, and especially wars. We've spent $8 trillion on wars, on useless wars, since 2002. Just an illustration of that: the Iraq War, which was the first of these wars, and all the other ones came out of it, except now the Ukraine, which is its own issue, but the same people started it. It's the neocons in the White House, Victoria Nuland and Robert Kagan and Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines, and these are the people that are driving the warfare state. And the Iraq War cost, and its aftermath, the wars in Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc., Pakistan, Afghanistan, cost us $8 trillion. And here's what we got for it: Iraq is now worse off than we found it. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We killed between 600,000 and 1 million Iraqis. We drove Iraq into a proxy posture with Iran, which is the exact foreign policy outcome that we've been trying to avoid for 40 years. Iraq today is this incoherent state that is just a battle between Shia and Sunni death squads. We created ISIS and then went to war in Syria against ISIS and drove 2 million refugees, and again, another useless war and failed war. And we drove 2 million refugees up into Europe, which destabilized all the democracies in Europe for the next generations. That led to Brexit, to the exit of Britain from the EU, and it also directly led to the riots that you're seeing in France today. So that's what we got for $8 trillion. Well, what did it cost? It cost every American family. And Congress doesn't come and say we're going to spend $8 trillion on failed wars. They're too scared to do that. So what they do is they just go to war, or the president does it, and then they print money. And when you print money, it causes inflation. So we spent $8 trillion on that. We spent $16 trillion on the COVID lockdowns.
You mentioned as we speak about these wars, you said some time ago that Russia invaded Ukraine in good faith, and that the United States.
I did not.
Okay, please correct that. Correct that.
That's not what I said. Here's what I said.
Okay.
I said, the comic book picture that we were given by our political leadership, by the White House, that this was an unprovoked invasion by a very overly ambitious Vladimir Putin trying to reestablish the Russian Empire is wrong. And I'm not making an excuse for Vladimir Putin. He did not need to go into Ukraine, and his invasion was illegal and brutal. But we have to understand that we provoked it. And we've been provoking it. The same people in the White House that I mentioned before, they call themselves the neocons, wanted this war with Russia. They wanted, and I'll give you a background, Armstrong. In 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev came to President Bush and Tony Blair and said, look, I'm going to dismantle the Soviet Union and I'm going to remove 400,000 troops from East Germany. And I'm going to let NATO unify Germany. He was letting NATO move in a hostile army, move into Germany and replace his 400,000 troops. He said, I'll do that, but the one commitment I want from you is that you will not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was at that time the Secretary of State, famously said to Gorbachev, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened in 1997, the neocons started taking over and they said, we're going to move NATO right up to the Russian border. And between now and then, they've moved it into not only 1 inch, but 1,000 miles to the east in 14 nations. We've also put Aegis missile systems, which are nuclear capable, in Poland and Romania, which are 12 minutes from Moscow. So we could decapitate the Soviet leadership in 12 minutes. And we walked away from the 2 nuclear treaties that we had signed with the Soviet that forbade intermediate nuclear weapons. So, when the Russians put missiles in Cuba in 1962, my uncle was going to be forced to invade Cuba because they're too close. Well, guess what? We're doing the exact same thing to the Russians. And the real reason Russia puts them in Cuba in 1962 is because we had put Jupiter missile systems in Turkey. And the Russians said, that's a red line for us. If you put them next to us, we're going to put them next to you.
Let me raise this with you, Mr. Kennedy.
So, but let me just finish this, because to answer your question, and I'll be very brief. The Russians said Ukraine is a red line. We helped to overthrow the government of the Ukraine, a democratically elected government in 2014, and we put in a pro-Western government. At that point, Putin says, well, I'm going to go in there if you don't, because I'm scared you're going to take over my port in Vladivostok, the only, in Crimea, the only warm water port. But he proposes a peace agreement, which the British or the Germans agreed to and the French agreed to, called the Minsk Accords, which was going to leave Ukraine intact. And we would not, and Zelensky runs in 2019 on the base and wins 70% of the vote as a peace candidate, saying, if I'm elected, I'm going to sign the Minsk Accords. That would have settled the whole thing. Well, what happened? We went over there and told him he couldn't sign it because we wanted the war with Russia. Then Russia puts in 40,000 troops. They clearly do not want to take over the country. There's 3.5 million people in Kiev. They're not going to take over with 40,000 troops, but they wanted us back at the negotiating table. Zelensky goes back to the negotiating table in March of 2022. They ink an agreement. They both initial it, and an agreement to settle the whole war based upon the Minsk Accords. And what happens? Russia, in good faith, and this is where I use that phrase, began removing all of its troops from Ukraine. What happened? Joe Biden sent Boris Yeltsin to Kiev to torpedo that agreement because we wanted the war. So since then,
it's clear to you that America wants this war. That is,
America doesn't want this war. Listen, my son was over there fighting. My son went and joined the special forces over there, joined the Foreign Legion. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive. Americans believe what our leaders tell us, which is that this was an unprovoked invasion. But our leaders were not telling us the truth. And now that is all coming out. You know, that agreement in March 2022, the public didn't know about that until 2 months ago, that we torpedoed that agreement. We should be outraged, because this war is really about the U.S. determination to put our troops and our missiles on Russia's border, something that we would not tolerate if they